Now I'm getting ready to paint in the squares, and I'm going to use two brushes. I'm going to use a small round brush, a sable brush that comes to a nice point, and I'm going to use a small flat brush to fill in the squares. And a flat brush is of course known because of its chiseled shape. So it goes up and straight across and then down the other side, but it does taper to a fine line. So it's easy to make a nice flat surface, just like the name. So I'm going to start with the light end of this grayscale, and I'm going to be painting wet paint next to wet paint. And I want to encourage you to become confident at doing that. It doesn't have to have a perfect edge. You need to get used to what it's like to feel paint touching other paint, and how do you work those edges back and forth. So I'm going to start by just simply working up to my pencil edge, and I'm keeping my paint slightly wet. I don't want it to drag. I don't want it to be too much of a dry filling in process, but I'm going to work up to that pencil edge. And actually, since these shapes are so small, I'm actually having no trouble just filling the whole shape in with this little round brush, so I probably won't even need the flat brush. So I'm going to work all the way over to the other pencil edge, and I want to make sure that the paint is going to go on here opaquely enough, so I'm going to fill it in, and then I'm going to build it up a little bit so that it actually has a nice clear version of that value in that location. I don't want it to be too thin, because then the white of the canvas will actually be affecting the nature of that value as we see it. So thin paint has light passing through it and reflecting off of the ground that the canvas has on it, and then bounces back, thus lightening the top color a little bit. So I'm filling in the first value that's white, pure white, nothing else in it, very clean, making sure that I don't grab any gray while I'm doing this. Okay, so I'm just building up the paint a little bit, getting it a little thicker, a little drier, so it starts to really look like a nice, strong, dramatic white. I don't want there to be so much build up though in terms of brush strokes that there's going to be a huge amount of texture, because the reflection on the edges of the texture would make it harder to see the value. Okay, so that white looks pretty nice, pretty clean, pretty crisp, pretty clear. And now I'm going to go to the next lighter gray, and in between I'm going to rinse my brush in my cleaning can. And this can, of course, is the one that you'll be using to clean your brushes whenever you need that brush. So what you do is you dip it into the top of the mineral spirits, which are in the top of the can. Wipe it on a paper towel. Just dip it and wipe it. And then, using the wire mesh that's inside of the can, work the brush back and forth very gently against the mesh until the brush is basically clean. Now, if we were stopping for the day, we would take our brushes after this point and we would clean them in the sink. But because we're going to keep painting, I just want the brush to be clean enough that it does not affect the next color that I'm going to be grabbing. And I want you to get used to working wet paint, adjoining wet paint. So don't be fearful. Let the paint touch. Let it butt right up against each other. You can go back if you need to and push the other side back against it. But paint is actually pretty good at holding its own position and not mixing. The only time that would occur is if the paint was really wet. Okay, that's the first gray. So I'm going to rinse my brush again in the same manner that I did before. So I dip it and wipe it, and then I go back and forth across the wire mesh that's inside of the can, getting rid of any bits of that value before I dip into the next value. So now I'm going to paint the third gray. Okay, that's done, and it's got a few problems. It's got too much change in the early part of the scale and too little change in this part of the scale. This part is probably okay, where that goes to the next gray and that goes to that gray. These three probably got a little close. This one needed to be a little bit lighter, and this one needed to be a little bit lighter. So probably what I'll do is let this dry, and then I'll remix those two values and go back in and alter those just a little bit. And that would be the process for painting a grayscale. Okay, that's it.